Thank you for attending my talk this morning. Today, my name is Boonyaratanakornkit. That's Boonyaratanakornkit, in case you guys are interested. It's a really long last name. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is tools for quality control management. I'm going to talk about software tools that are available, especially one of our software, which we called EZQC Online. The website is www.ezqconline.com. Going into this, first of all, our legal and limitation statement that our legal department asks us always to put on. This software, since we're going to be talking about our software, we want to ensure that the laboratory is still responsible to meeting their local, state, and national regulations to meet their accreditation requirements. And so we're going to go into a little bit about quality control management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. And in quality control management, it can be pretty confusing and quite daunting to a clinical laboratory. There's many stages to quality control management. What we see here is a quick breakdown. There could be more and there could be less. But basically what we see is that there's validation, there's training, there's maintenance, and there's monitoring. When you validate or verify your assay, this is going into the stages of implementation of the assay, where you're looking at establishing linearity, accuracy, dynamic range, LOD, LOQ, precision, interfering substances, reference ranges. There's a lot of experiments and a lot of statistics that need to be done in this portion. And then what are the guidelines that need to be followed to validate and to verify? Moving forward, training, making sure that the operators are proficient at running these assays. Are they running them? Are they performing them accurately? Are they performing them with high level of precision? And after training, maintaining the performance of this assay. Are we performing calibration verification? Are these operators proficient? And even are these labs proficient? And finally, the last thing is monitoring. Are we monitoring the performance of the assay over time? Are we trending analysis? Even further, can we look at the performance of this assay in comparison to other peers? So talking a little bit about the challenges. As molecular testing gets much more adopted, there's a lot of how to implement these assays. What are the guidelines? And there are CAP checklists. There's ISO 15189. There's publications by New York State. What are these guidelines? How do you interpret these guidelines? They tell you what to run. Like they tell you, you need to run accuracy, you need to run precision. But really, what are the number of days? What are the number of runs? What are the number of replicates? Right now, what we've seen is that there's quite a number of literature out there that talk about how to perform these assay implementations, these validations, these verifications. And we cite a lot of these papers in this talk later on, and we can talk about how they approached validating their molecular assays. Just a reminder, if there's any questions during this talk, please feel free to put it into your Q&A console and just ask, and we'll go over these questions at the end of the talk. So a little bit about this software that we've created. We created a software that kind of goes through all these assay implementation, and it kind of streamlines this entire process. When we look at this software, it breaks down into three modules. The validation verification, which was the assay implementation portion I talked about, the calibration verification, which is the monitoring portion, the maintenance portion, and then QC monitoring, which is the monitoring the daily QC portion. And how does the software do this? It takes a couple inputs from the laboratory. It takes assay information, the instrument information, the materials, and the guidelines. It takes this information, and with this information, you can then create these studies, the validation verification, the QC monitoring studies. The software guides you through each one of these processes and then creates a report, and all the statistical analysis are automatically computed. Later on, at the end of this talk, I'm going to go a little bit into the software, how it works, how we designed it. It's been a lot of work was put into the software, a lot of interviews with clinical lab directors to kind of get their input, because we wanted to create a software that exactly meets the clinical lab's needs. So let's talk a little bit about validation verification. I'm going to go a little bit over why labs need to do validation verification, what are some of the available guidelines that are out there, and go in a little bit details, and then show a little bit software how it helps with the validation verification. So validation verification. Well, first of all, what is validation? What is verification? Well, verification is defined by the FDA and ISO guidelines as confirmation. So verification, the performance characteristics are established by the manufacturer. The manufacturer establishes the accuracy, the precision, the LOD, any types of interfering substances, any types of cross-reactivity. And it's only, the lab's only responsibility is to verify those performances. And we'll go into a little bit of the guidelines, what does verification exactly mean. Validation, on the other hand, is more intended for lab-developed tests or modified IVD tests. And this is where the lab now must establish the performance characteristics. Okay? And so the next thing is, well, the CAP checklist requires that any verification be performed for FDA-cleared assays. And even the ISO 15189, they go into a little bit more details about what needs to be done during a validation or a verification. For example, performance requirements required are like LODs, quantification limits, linearity, sensitivity measurements. But as you can see, this is a lot of words of statistics. But what exactly, how do you perform a linearity study? How do you perform a sensitivity study? How do you set acceptance and rejection criteria? These are the elements that these types of guidelines don't go into details about. They don't tell us you need to run this for 4 days, you need to run 6 levels, you need to run 3 replicates of each level. It doesn't go into details. And so this is where we actually had to look for more literature that talks about this. And so one of the literature we're going to reference is something by Dr. Rabinow. And this is a paper that he talked about validating a clinical virology test for ISO 15189. And he puts together a table showing what's required when you're doing a verification, what's required during a validation. As you can see from a verification standpoint, there's less things that need to be done. There's less sensitivity. There's no sensitivity analysis. There's no specificity analysis. These are established by the manufacturer. But accuracy, precision, and linearity is still required for this laboratory to verify the performance of the assay. And in validation, everything is required. Another paper is by Lynn Sloan from Mayo. This paper was published in 2007, and it was about validating PCR in clinical microbiology. There's a table in this paper that's very, very good. It breaks down what needs to be done in an IVD test versus a lab-developed or a modified test, but it also breaks it down between a different assay between a qualitative assay and a quantitative assay. There's different levels and different amounts of specimens required, and she goes into quite details about what the concentrations, how many levels, how many replicates, and even how many days. And so what we did with these papers is that we programmed these recommendations into the software. So the software stores these peer-reviewed papers and then can be called upon to look at these guidelines, how many levels, how many replicates, how many days. So summarizing the validation verification background, what needs to be done? So in a laboratory, first of all, again, it's guideline interpretation. What do they need to do to establish the molecular test? They typically typically refer to other laboratories, how did they perform it, and we also look at literature. So we're interpreting the guidelines. Then we must create our own protocols that match up to these guidelines, that see, do we meet these guidelines? Are we passing the acceptance criteria? Then we need to find the materials, run the study, run the statistical analysis, and review and write a report. And a lot of these stages, it can take a long time. what we've done is did a quick study. We surveyed quite a number of people in 2010, and we found that an average time to validate a molecular test takes about 58 days, 58 business days. And some of it might be shorter. I mean, we've talked to customers where it's been under 2 weeks, and we've talked to people where it's taken a year. And so with this case, when we saw this and when we talked to customers, we wanted to create a software that kind of streamlines this process that could reduce some of the headaches and reduce the time of the validation verification. And so we created this software, which is what we call EZQC. And so the workflow of the software is basically designing your study, where you put in your information, what assay you're going to use, what kind of guidelines you want to follow, what peer-reviewed paper do you want to follow. You can modify these guidelines, and I'm going to show you a little bit more detail later on how you do this. You can then define your study. You can choose what materials you want to use, what's the acceptance criteria, define your personnel, and then the software automatically generates the protocol. And this protocol can then be taken into the lab, the study is performed, and immediately the results can be uploaded into the software and analyzed. A report is generated, and then this report can be filed away with the validation binder for this molecular test. So what does the software do? What kind of experiments are the software tackling? Well, we're following things that are recommended by the CAP checklist and ISO 15189. For example, the CAP checklist, it asks us to do accuracy and precision study, any limit of detection studies, also interfering substances, and quite a bit more. And so in the software, it tackles all these statistics. It tackles precision. In the precision, it tackles within run and between run. We tackle accuracy, limit of detection by probability analysis, linearity, dynamic range. We tackle interfering substances, method comparison, so method correlation between assays. We also tackle clinical sensitivity and specificity, cross-reactivity, reference ranges, and control limits, which is in the QC monitoring portion of the software. So again, this is the homepage of the software, ezqconline.com. Again, it takes those 4 stages: design, protocol, performing, running the assay, and then looking at the reports. 4 simple stages in the software. What you first see when you log into the software is the home page. And a home page shows what are ongoing studies, what reports that you have available, what are the assays you have in your laboratory, and what are the QC readings. And this dashboard allows you to quickly link out to view all the pertinent information. And it also shows you the status of your studies. Are you running it? Are you completed? Is your controls within the limits for QC monitoring? So like I mentioned in the software of it, before we can actually run a study, we must set up the information in the laboratory. And so some of the assay information that's required is, some of the laboratory information that's required is like assay information, instrument information, and material setup. Some of this is already predefined. This is more for lab-developed tests and identifying unique identifiers for the instrument. And when you set up an assay, you can name your assay, identify the number of targets. So you can create a multiplex assay with this software. What controls are required with the software? What controls and reagents are required with the assay? When you set up the instrument, you set up whether it's an extraction instrument, an amplification instrument, what's the manufacturer, what's the serial number. These are all identifiers that when you call upon, you validate and you check the calibration verification on these instrumentations and these assays. And material setups. This is where you can define materials. We have a predefined material list in there because we are light technologies and we're acrometrics and we have standards and controls. But again, this software does not requiring our materials to be used. It can be to find your materials, competitors' materials into the software as well. And so when you define a material, all you need to define is the name of the material, the sample type that the material belongs in, and concentrations of the material. if known. So once you define all those elements, the assay, the instrument, the materials, what you can do next is take that information and start creating studies. And the first study we're going to talk about is validation verification studies. And so when you put information, you first select what assay are you going to do, what are you going to do a validation or verification, what instruments, what serial numbers, what ID numbers are you going to use for your assay verification. What's stored inside the software actually is some predefined assays. So this is something when you're doing lab developed tests, we can create the assays. But if there is a IVD cleared test, you can select that, and all this information is pre-populated. For example, if you selected a Roche HIV version 2.0 assay, immediately you know, the software knows you're doing a verification, you're doing using Cobas AmperPrep, and you're using Cobas TaqMan, and the input volumes are already predefined into the software. So everything is predefined if you're using an IVD assay. It's much, much simpler. Next stage is the guideline setup. And so what you see is a list, you know you're doing a verification or a validation, and it lists out all the experiments that need to be done. And you can select predefined guidelines as well, whereas if you select certain, like if you want to follow CLIA New York State or ISO 15189, you can select on the side, and basically it generates, based on a list of peer-reviewed articles, what are these guidelines? How many days? How many replicates? How many replicates of positive levels and negative levels? And then finally, you can name and review the study. So a little bit guideline suggestion again. So this is a snapshot. This, again, what I showed you earlier was from Lynn Sloan's paper. This is our interpretation of what that paper referred to. And what you can see is the number of days, replicates, and positive levels and negative levels required for each one of these experiments, like analytical sensitivity, quantitative accuracy. Now, again, we want the software to be as flexible. And so this guideline, even though it's a recommendation, the lab can still change it. For example, if they disagree, they want more levels to be done during accuracy analysis, they can change the levels and save the guideline uniquely to their own laboratory. And then this guideline can be called upon again next time when another validation or verification study is performed. So once that's defined, once the study is defined, we have to design a couple more elements into the study before generating a protocol. One thing that has to be defined, first off, is preparing the materials. I know you might ask, okay, we just defined the materials. Well, the prepared materials allows you to select what you want to do with these materials. Are you going to dilute the materials? Because once you select these aspects of what you're going to do, it will actually create dilution schemes that you need to perform in order to get the levels, the correct levels to meet the guidelines. You can define additional controls, any kit controls, any laboratory samples that you want to run inside the studies, as well as additional standards. You can also set acceptance criteria. Now, this is important because you can't move past to generate protocol and set acceptance criteria for each one of your statistics that you want to perform. For example, you have to set acceptable percent CVs, acceptable delta logs from the expected for a quantitative accuracy study. All these need to be set. I mean, there's some experiments or some statistics in there that don't need acceptance criteria like LOD, where you're establishing an LOD, but for most cases, everything needs to be set, acceptance criteria. And this is up to the lab how they want to set these acceptance criteria. Once the study is completed and all the statistics are analyzed, the results are compared against the acceptance criteria that were originally set. So you define reagents, and this is where you actually define the lot numbers, like expiration dates of your reagents. You can then also arrange your plates. So if you have a 96 well plate or a 384 well plate or something else, and you don't like the setup, right now it's just setting it up horizontally, you can actually change it to however way you want it to go. And then you can define the operators, who in your laboratory is actually going to perform this validation verification. All this information is then used to generate a protocol. So before I show you the protocol, I just wanted to talk about the plate layout really quickly. Just be really quick. You can drag and drop your samples anywhere along the plates, and it will save in your plate layout. The reason this is also very important is when you're creating a multiplex assay, it also uses the same mechanism. So envision a 384-well plate or a 96-well plate, and you want to find that this column is this target and this column is this target. You would drag these targets into this plate, and the software will remember that this is the plate layout of your multiplex assay. So, protocol. So, as I said, after all of this information is assigned, you generate a protocol, and you can generate a PDF protocol or a Word document. And this Word document then can be modified to meet your laboratory's needs. If you need to add on a cover sheet, additional signatures, any type of templates that you guys typically use. But inside this protocol is a summary. It's a summary of the entire study. You get your whole list of all the plate layouts, and you get your dilution schemes. Basically, this protocol is meant to be a self-contained protocol that the laboratory can then take into the operator can take into their laboratory, flip through it, and just run it. At the end of the protocol, the last page is actually a signature page for the lab director, the person who wrote the protocol, and approvals. So now we're moving into the third stage of the study, which is where we're running the study now. Just to let you know, one thing I want to talk about the software is that the software actually has hierarchical access. So whereas I know I mentioned the director, I mentioned during my talk the supervisor, also mentioned the operator/technician. These are different access levels for these users, and these allow them to set they have different responsibilities within the software. So a lab director can only approve the protocol. A supervisor can design the study. An operator can run and input data into the software. This allows laboratories to control and protect their data from any accidental changes or anything. So going into running studies. So it's important that once you get the data, that you put it in right away, you analyze it, you put together an organized plan so that you get a clear picture of how your assay is performing. And so that's what we wanted to do with the software. We wanted to create a statistical package inside the software that can do all these analysis. There's other statistical packages out there. I mean, there's what the laboratories, I would imagine majority of laboratories use spreadsheet programs like Excel, and they have templates, they code in the statistics. Other softwares are out there, there's like EP Evaluator, Analyze It. But what we did with our software is that it's statistical analysis, but it has that front end with the guidelines, how to guide people, and the flexibility to adapt to the laboratory's needs. So when you record results into your software, first of all, you set your date. What date did you run your results? Again, you could put in the lot numbers and reagent expiration dates. If you predefined it in your study, it's all pre-populated into the software immediately. When uploading data, you can manually enter the data. And it's very similar to a spreadsheet-like format. You can just type in your values, either in log or scientific notation. The software will know what type of value you're trying to put in. You could also upload, and you can upload using an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV file, and the software would then upload immediately the data into and populate these cells. Once you have all the data populated there, you can manually exclude values if for some reason you know that this value, there was a pipetting error, and even though there's a value that came out, it's probably not a reliable value. You can immediately ignore the value and comment. And ignoring the value will remove it from the statistical analysis. It'd still be there in the final report though, because the raw data will all be stored inside the report. So before the statistical analysis is completed, immediately the software does outlier analysis after the last data point is put in. And the outlier analysis gives the user a view of what possibly could be an outlier. And it utilizes a box plot method to do an outlier analysis. This here is an example from a method correlation study where they had a reference method as well as a comparative method. And this is where they're doing an outlier analysis for each one of the levels that was used in that reference method and that comparative method. So we use box plot, like I mentioned, and anything outside 3 times the interquartile range or below the 3 times interquartile range is flagged as an outlier. The software, again, does not exclude that value immediately. It just flags it. It's up to the user's responsibility if they want to deem it that is truly an outlier and to eliminate it. So once this is immediately done, the statistics are calculated. And this is all immediately done. I mean, literally it takes, you can see a loading bar as the statistics are calculated. And within a minute, all the statistics are completed and a report is generated. So I'm just going to go over a couple statistics. I'm not going to go over all the statistics. Just give you a snapshot of what statistics are performed, how it looks, and what are the graphical displays that are shown. For example, here is accuracy. What we see here is you get a difference plot or a Bland-Altman plot. This is where you're comparing your observed value. This was run off an HCV panel. Your observed value versus the expected value. And in the acceptance criteria, you set what is an acceptable delta log. And for example, in this case, unfortunately I can't see. The font is very, very small. Hopefully it's larger on your side. But I'm thinking it's 0.3 or 0.3 logs. So they set the difference at 0.3 logs. And what the software does is it calculates all the log differences. And if it's less than that 0.3 logs difference, it's a pass. If it's greater, it's a fail. And you get a Bland-Altman. The red is the mean. The solid line is a perfect difference plot where it's a difference of 0. And we can see that we're slightly under quantifying across this assay, but it's still within specifications. Next thing we can look at is linearity. And so this is just a regression analysis plot. It looks at certain acceptance criteria like what's the acceptable slope. And the perfect slope, if we're meeting expected values, is a slope of 1. And so we look at perfection, how close is it to a slope of 1. Intercept also is looking how close we acceptable intercept to intercept of 0. Another statistic, a little bit more complicated, is the limited detection analysis or the analytical sensitivity. And this is where we do a probit regression on the data. And when you do a limited detection analysis, you're taking, in the guideline, they recommend about 6 levels and 10 replicates for each one of those levels. And here we do a binary analysis where we do positive or negative. What is the number of detected levels and what are the numbers of negative levels? And we didn't do a probit regression and identify what is the concentration that has a 95% detection limit. In this case, the 95% detection limit is 90.3 IUs per ml. We also can calculate the confidence interval, which is, for in this case, 75 to about 108. So again, reminder, if there's any questions, put it into the Q&A console, and we'll get to that at the end of the talk. Once all the statistical analysis, a report is generated. And this is very similar to the protocol. Again, it's a Word document or a PDF document. It gives you a summary of all your results, what you did, what the dilution schemes were done. It also gives you the raw data, what you ignored, what you commented out. And signature pages again, where you can record, have approvals, lab director approvals or supervisor approval. And you can then take this report and file it away. So this was the final stage. It is a very, very simple process. So again, we went through the 4 stages really quickly in software. We designed your study. We selected what assays you're going to use. We went into defining your studies where we defined the materials, prepared the materials, what acceptance criteria. And then we went into running the data. And then finally, we analyzed and generated a report. And what we hoped with designing the software that we could streamline this process. As you can see, it was just a couple pages, a couple inputs, and immediately protocols and reports are generated. And yet the software still has the capabilities to be flexible enough. You can set your own acceptance criteria. You can change the guidelines. And if you change the guidelines, the software will change as needed. And what's even in there, hidden in there that I didn't even show, is that there's a lot of optimization built into the software. For example, when you saw the guidelines, you saw there's replicates and levels for accuracy, there's replicates and levels for linearities, replicates and levels for dynamic range. Well, for most cases, you would realize as you're running the experiments, well, I can use the data from accuracy for the linearity study. I can use the data from the linearity study for the dynamic range studies. I do not need to run separate levels, replicates, and for each one of these studies. The software actually is aware of that and will actually combine the materials that you define into to give you the biggest bang for your buck. It basically will allow you to do as much with that run with that material. And it basically saves time, saves reagent costs, and saves materials. So going outside of validation verification now, we're going to talk very quickly about calibration verification. This is a very, very simple statistics that's run. Why do we run calibration verification? Well, this is in the US, it's required by CLIA. It's required for quantitative assays that every 6 months the set 3 levels are tested, high, medium, and low. It is tested as within that the assay is still performing within calibration. And typically this is done using other samples that the lab may have, or even like standards and controls that we could provide or other competitors could provide. What this software does is that it does an accuracy analysis. It does an accuracy analysis. Sorry about that. An accuracy analysis for the levels. And the cool thing about this is that in your dashboard, it tells you whether you are in calibration, what date you are on. And at the end, a month before the 6-month expiration date, it will actually send you an email reminding you, please do your calibration verification. So the final module that we're going to talk about is QC monitoring and daily QC. And I know that this is something that's typically done using Excel spreadsheets, or is done more frequently in a clinical chemistry environment, or even, and it's basically monitoring, and we're utilizing Leving-Jennings plots and Westgard rules to kind of establish these control limits and what levels would they fall inside these control limits or warning lines. So again, why do we run daily QC controls? The CAP checklist requires us to run these controls, unless for some special exceptions. For quantitative testing, it typically requires 3 run controls, a negative, a low, and a high positive control. If you're running a qualitative test, you can run negative controls or positive controls. So this software actually can track your controls over a time period, and daily QC allows laboratories to see drifts over time. And we can go into details of how we can slice and dice this data. The software allows you to slice and dice this data into many, many different formats. What we go a little bit further with daily QC is that we added peer comparison. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about what peer comparison and why peer comparison might be important to your laboratory. Peer comparison allows you to actually see how the performance of your assay stacks up to other laboratories that are utilizing the same controls and the same assay. So we create 11 Jennings plots with this with the daily QC, and we can set control limits, and these are 3 standard deviations plus 2 standard deviation warning lines. When setting this up, we set the control limits. You can select it by lot number, what lots you want to use, what control lots you want to use, and you can compute these control limits, these warning lines, these 3 standard deviations, 2 standard deviation warning lines, by manually entering the value, which you manually enter the mean and the standard deviations of your controls on the assay, or you can actually ask the software to compute the control limits from previous runs. And you can select the dates, how far you want to go back, how many number of control runs did you run. It will establish those means and standard deviations based on this data. When you generate a report, you can slice and dice, like what I said, you can slice and dice the data in many different ways. You can view it by the assay lot number, the control lot number, the instrumentation ID, the operator, and then you can view these control limits based on those inputs. If you select My Lab, that's what you're doing. You're checking your operators, your assay, your control lots. But if you select My Network or All Laboratories, this is where we're going more into the peer comparison portion of the software. Final thing you can do with the software is actually send you automatic reports. So you can select the frequency of reports. If you want to get a report of what your operator entering data every day, every week, or every month, this will then be emailed to you, and then a PDF will be emailed to you showing you the performance of your assay every day. So network and peer comparison. Now this is always a little bit contentious because it's sharing data. The sharing of the data, this allows you to share your QC monitoring. It also, in some cases, it also allows you to share protocols in the validation verification if you're collaborating with the lab. You can set different levels of sharing. You can choose not to share any data. You can choose to share data with only your network, or you can choose to share data with all your peers. And what I mean by network, so this software also, because it's a cloud-based, it's a web-based software, it allows you to kind of do like a LinkedIn, like a laboratory LinkedIn between each other. And this allows you to invite another laboratory to join your network. And you can send out emails inviting them, and they can accept the invitation or they can decline the invitation. And once they join the network, you can then do peer comparison with these other networks. So just a couple more slides and then we're done. Peer comparison, just to give you a quick snapshot of the peer comparison, these are a couple graphs that are available in the peer comparison module. You can assess how precise your assay is performing compared to the other labs. So in this case, the red dot is where this lab is performing precision-wise for their assay across all the other labs. It's right there in the middle. You also get a union plot which compares the precision as well as the accuracy. And basically, if you're closer to the center where you're pretty much accurate compared to all the other labs and precise compared to all the other labs, you're in the green area of the lab, and yellow, orange, red distinguish further how far you're away from accuracy and precision compared to the other labs.